We decided to honor our seniors this year, so we're doing a senior showcase, and our two seniors, right now, we actually have three, but one graduated in December, so I want to just give a shout out to Alex Darmody, who was a senior on our team and a big part of the program, but graduated in December, will be walking with us in May. So we didn't want to leave her out, but she's been working full time, so she was able to be with us today. But our two seniors that are finishing and graduating in May are Garrett and Tekoa Bell, so they'll be performing for you today. A couple of notes about Garrett, and then I'm going to let Tom, after Garrett performs, talk about Tekoa. So Garrett is a 4-year member of our program. In that time, Garrett has qualified for the Elite National Tournament 3 of his 4 years. It's not an easy feat. Very few people qualify for that tournament. Garrett has qualified 3 of the 4 years. Garrett has also taken 6th place in the international competition when we competed internationally during the pandemic. This year, Garrett has been in finals of all of his events all year. He won 1st place in most of the season tournaments in both persuasive, communication analysis, and Extemp. In the state tournament, Garrett has taken 3rd, 4th, and 4th in his events. Additionally, he won debate at Park. He's also won numerous other debate tournaments. There's a lot to say about Garrett, and I could talk a long time. Last thing I need to say, because this is kind of great, Garrett also in his free time has served as president for us for 2 years. He's been an amazing leader. We don't know what we're going to do without him. And he's been a lobbyist in Congress to support increased funding for neurofibromatosis, which is kind of pretty major, and he has gotten that increase in funding. They've asked him back numerous years. So Garrett's a pretty incredible guy. We're going to miss him a lot. So he's going to start by giving you his persuasive speech. In persuasive speaking, what we're doing is we're persuading the audience to decide to do whatever it is we're talking about. Oftentimes it's something you haven't heard about, and it's something we want you to do, or we want you to get behind, that sort of thing. I don't want to say too much about it because I want to show you his persuasive. So I'm going to go to the back and I'm going to give Garrett the microphone, and then please help me welcome Garrett Dolke, and he will give you his persuasive speech.
Ryan Last was your typical 17-year-old high school senior. He got good grades, held a second degree black belt, had an affinity for animals, and was looking forward to his first semester of college. His parents knew what social media apps he was on and when he was using them. But one night, that all changed. An account posing as a woman on Instagram DM'd Ryan, expressing romantic interest in him. The two held conversation, which eventually turned into an exchange of sexually explicit photos. But after Ryan sent his photos, the woman's tone abruptly changed. She demanded money from Ryan. Not only that, but she threatened that if he did not pay up, she'd make those photos public. Panicked, Ryan paid the ransom. But later that night, overwhelmed by feelings of grief and humiliation, Ryan took his own life. Unfortunately, Ryan's story is not an isolated occurrence. This new wave of sexual exploitation, known as sextortion, has led the FBI scrambling to spread awareness to this silent epidemic. The BBC on December 20th, 2022 explains that in 2022 alone, there were at least 7,000 reported cases of sextortion. But perhaps even more troubling is the demographic group making up a majority of new cases. A July 5th, 2022 CBS News report finds that these sextortionists have found a primary new target: young boys. So today, we'll first look at what is causing this rise in sextortion cases among young boys, the effects it has had, before finally finding some critical solutions. So, what is causing this rise in sextortion cases among young boys? There are 2 main causes: the boys' age and their gender. The aforementioned CBS News report explains that the majority of cases involving young men were between the ages of 14 and 17. In a March 23, 2022 CNN article, Dr. Scott Hanlon, chief of adolescent medicine at UMass General Hospital, explains that teenagers' brains have yet to fully develop. So when a catastrophic event occurs, like an encounter with a sextortionist, teenagers are unable to see past the current moment and understand that they will be okay in the long run. NBC News on May 25, 2022 furthers by explaining that teenage boys are simply easier to coerce into taking these sexually explicit videos of themselves. And NY360 on August 15th of 2021 tells the story of 15-year-old Riley, who also fell victim to sextortion. Quite an outdoorsman himself, Riley dreamed of a future career in environmental conservation. He too would start an online relationship with someone through Instagram. And after being unable to put up the $3,500 in ransom, Riley took his own life. Teenage boys like Ryan and Riley simply believe that their photos will be made public and feel ashamed because of it. This lends us directly into our second cause, traditional male gender roles. Psychology Today on July 10th, 2022 states, teenage boys are more likely to fall victim to sextortion because they are online more regularly, targeted more regularly, and less selective in choosing their sexual partners. So through both their age and their gender, these sextortionists have found a primary new target. And it is having some horrific consequences. There are two devastating effects to this rise in sextortion cases: mass financial loss and declining mental health among victims. First, the Washington Post on March 24, 2022 reveals that sextortionists often demand large sums of money from their young, unsuspecting victims. These ransoms are then paid for through accessible means to teenagers, such as through cash apps and gift cards. Like in Ryan's case, the criminal originally asked for $5,000. And while Ryan was able to lower that number to just $150, money that came out of his own personal college fund, that $150 is just a fraction of the $13.6 million accounted for in sextortion-related ransoms in 2021 alone, according to FBI data reported on by the Boston Herald on April 27th of 2022. To teenage boys like Ryan and Riley, just a couple of $100 might be the cost of their life. That devastating reality leads us into our second effect: declining mental health among victims. In the online edition of Input magazine published on August 15th of 2022, survivors of sextortion tell their stories. Like 17-year-old Sean. Sean met his sextortionist through the social media app Discord, and after being fooled into filming a sexually explicit video of himself, for which he thought he was just on a private video chat for, the sextortionist revealed their true identity. And while Sean was able to block the sextortionist and avoid payment, the psychological effects only escalated. Sean recalls major spikes in anxiety and depression, having one intrusive thought: I thought my life was over. And while some victims end up like Sean, traumatized, but alive, others end up like Ryan and Riley. The devastating fact of the matter is that we do not know truly how many victims of sextortion have committed suicide. But the stories speak for themselves. Local NBC News affiliate in Madison, Wisconsin tells the story of 17-year-old Jordan DeMay. The high school football star committed suicide within 6 hours of meeting his sextortionist. He truly believed that those photos would be made public to his family and Instagram followers. So not only are sextortionists taking the lives of young men, but they're destroying families along the way. There are two critical solutions to putting an end to the sextortion epidemic: resources and legislation. But first, it is important to promote upon and expand currently existing resources. Part of the problem is that there is a preconceived notion by young boys that there is nowhere to turn if they fall victim. Luckily, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is leading the way. They have launched their cyber tip line. This is an online portal in which victims can report their encounters. This not only alerts the appropriate law enforcement agencies, but also allows victims to be put in contact with crisis intervention counselors for both the victims and their families. At the end of this event, I encourage you to take one of my yellow handouts on the side table. There you can find more information as well as a QR code that can send you to a link to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's website, if you or someone you ever know falls victim. But secondly, there are legislative solutions. As HG Legal Resources outlines last access on March 3rd of 2023, while the act of sextortion is a crime, current federal laws are not doing enough. Because there is no clear law that outlines what sextortion is, even in the rare instances when perpetrators are caught and charged, they can often only be charged with possession of child pornography or extortion. There is no comprehensive law that outlines what sextortion is and makes it a clear criminal offense. Also on that QR code, you can find a link to my online petition calling on Congress to do exactly that. So today, we have better understood what is causing this rise in sextortion cases, seen the effects it has had, and found some critical solutions. This year would have been Ryan's first year of college. But unfortunately, he was just one of the thousands of young men that have fallen victim to sextortion. And if we don't do anything soon, he will not be the last.
I have the pleasure to introduce our other graduating senior, Tekoa Bell. I was lucky enough to have her as a student during the pandemic, and once the pandemic lifted, we convinced her to join the speech team. She is an amazing woman in her own right, being a SUG scholar and having the Maladon Scholarship in History and Politics and Law. She also provides service through being a connection leader and working on the Student Literacy Corps. So she was an outstanding young woman before she joined the team, and that excellence has just soared as she's been a member of our team. She has advanced to the elimination rounds in 2/3 of the tournaments that she's attended. She has taken on new speech topics, and she is always the most cheerful, most enthusiastic, and most friendly and welcoming person on the team. So it is absolutely my pleasure to introduce Tekoa Bell, who will give you an informative speech. Informative speeches seem kind of self-evident, but usually we try to find subjects that are a little bit out of the mainstream so that people can learn new and innovative things that are sort of on the cutting edge. So please welcome Tekoa Bell.
Famous influencer and kickboxer Andrew Tate once stated that he would grip her by the throat if you're accused by a woman of cheating. In December of last year, ABC News reported that Andrew Tate was arrested in Romania on charges of rape and human trafficking. However, there are still several fan accounts dedicated to posting content of Andrew Tate. One account on TikTok, @Tate_clips, has over 106,000 followers. Toxic influencers like Tate have seemingly skyrocketed overnight, amassing millions of followers. This is largely in part to social media algorithms, which have contributed to the pipeline of online radicalization. Today, we'll define the technology behind social media algorithms, analyze their effects, before finally exploring two implications. First, what exactly are social media algorithms? According to the Digital Media Institute in January 2022, they define social media algorithms as a neural network that ranks and sorts content on a person's social media feed. This is so the person doesn't have to. Instead, they passively input data into the algorithm by liking, watching, and commenting on content. In exchange, these algorithms suggest posts that are similar to what a person has interacted with in the past. For example, if I watch a baking video on YouTube, this signals to the algorithm that I might be interested in watching more baking videos. So the algorithm recommends more baking videos, more baking YouTubers, and other related content. Soon enough, my entire YouTube feed could be filled with dinner recipes, food vloggers, or even people doing crazy cooking challenges. However, if I've expressed a disinterest or even a dislike in this topic, then the algorithm will recommend something that I'd like better. Social media companies like Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube all use social media algorithms. Time magazine furthers in September 2022 that social media is engineered to be as addicting as possible, making the use of algorithms key. After all, no one wants to put down their phones if they're getting the content that they enjoy. So, incentivized by the millions in ad revenue, social media companies use algorithms to encourage their users to scroll through content and advertisements for as long as possible. However, these social media algorithms have two effects on their audiences. The first is the spread of extremist content on the internet, because social media algorithms work that way. They recommend content to you. However, when people are exposed to this extremist content, they're likely to imitate it in their own lives. But first, we'll analyze how social media algorithms spread extremist content on the internet. The Institute of Strategic Dialogue in April of 2022 conducted a study on how YouTube uses its algorithms to recommend content to its audiences. These algorithms use a variety of demographics: age, gender, race, etc. However, the study found that boys under the age of 18 years old were more likely than other demographics to be recommended videos that were misogynistic. Further, the study also found that white men were twice as likely to be recommended videos that promoted white nationalism. Additionally, people like you or me who like and watch videos on YouTube for fun will be recommending videos become more and more extreme in nature. Where starts of the day of me watching a baking video could end in watching political conspiracy theories. And that's not all. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in September 2022 further reported on the disturbing trend of algorithms intentionally pushing controversial content to young audiences. This content is often the first exposure that young people have to the manosphere, a network of toxic internet sites where men's rights and misogyny are promoted and shared. Racism, sexism, and other forms of prejudice run rampant on these spaces, making it a safe space for the alt-right. However, young men in particular have reported that they've identified with the manosphere because they feel these platforms like Reddit and 4chan better address their issues than other platforms like Facebook or Instagram. It also helps that Redditors provide handy scapegoats that people can use to blame for their problems, like gender equality and critical race theory. Regardless, these spaces drastically shape how people perceive the issues surrounding masculinity, feminism, and politics. And so, that leads us to our second effect, that when people are exposed to these extremist ideologies, they imitate them in their own lives. Laura Bates, founder of the Everyday Sexism Project, wrote in April of 2022 that young people want to become successful but don't always know where to start. So they turn to the trusty and reliable friend, the internet. Influencers like Elon Musk, Andrew Tate, or even Logan and Jake Paul, a sibling duo infamous for the viral YouTube pranks, all seem like ideal role models. After all, they drive fancy cars, they wear designer outfits, they're incredibly rich, and they're super famous. However, when young people emulate these lifestyles, they also emulate the ideologies. CNN in September 2022 reported that boys as young as 13 years old were sexually harassing their female classmates and parroting quotes that they'd seen on the internet, like "depression isn't real." Not only are these young men harming their friends, families, and loved ones by imitating these behaviors, but they're also harming themselves by internalizing these beliefs. And so, there are two implications that these social media algorithms have for our future. The first is the increase in both real-world and online violence, as evidenced by the spread of extremist ideologies. However, social media algorithms can also be used for good by monitoring content on the internet. But first, we'll explore how social media algorithms will lead to both real-world and online violence. The Pew Research Center in April 2021 conducted a study that found that women, in increasing numbers in the past 10 years, have reported being sexually harassed online. Further, 54% of Black and Hispanic participants reported being attacked online because of their race and ethnicity, a marked increase in the past 5 years. Not only that, but the BBC World News found that in September 2022, an online forum consisting of 17,000 members had a post made about committing violent sexual assault every 30 minutes. Not only are these spaces fostering an unsafe space for both women and minorities, but it's also spreading the hate on the internet. Further, what starts online doesn't always stay online. In the forum I mentioned, with 17,000 members, it was linked to over 100 attacks in the real world against women and minorities. Not only that, but domestic shooters often have a tie within the online manosphere. So, Pulse nightclub, Orlando, Florida, 2016, Buffalo, New York, Tops Friendly Supermarket, 2022, and Uvalde, Texas, Rob's Elementary School, 2022, all the shooters there had one thing in common. They were radicalized on the internet. However, though social media algorithms have contributed to a world of harm, they can also be used to promote some good by monitoring and filtering content on the internet. The Verge in November 2022 reported that Facebook has used algorithms in its moderation. These algorithms, again, rank and sort for posts on social media, but are instead searching for violations of terms of service. So hate speech, misinformation, and spam all get flagged. Hate speech and misinformation, the more serious violations, get dealt with first, while less serious violations like spam get dealt with later. These algorithms are essential in preserving the mental, emotional, and physical health of real human moderators. These human moderators have criticized fixed policies in the past because they were constantly subjected to emotionally disturbing content, which resulted in symptoms of trauma and PTSD. However, these social media algorithms can trawl the dark underbelly of Facebook so that real people don't have to. And so, today, we defined the technology behind social media algorithms, analyzed their effects, before finally exploring two implications. As of today, April 18th, 2023, Andrew Tate sits in house arrest, awaiting charges on rape and human trafficking. There will always be generally terrible people like Andrew Tate, but hopefully in the future, algorithms will not give people like him the platform that they do not deserve.
Here in just a moment, you'll hear from Garrett once again. He'll be performing an extemporaneous speech. And then after that, you're going to hear from Tekoa. She'll be performing her persuasive speech. In extemporaneous speaking, students are given 30 minutes to prepare a 7-minute speech on a number of issues that affect them here in the United States and around the globe. They talk about anything from what's happening right here in Missouri to what's happening in the country of Djibouti, or tackling huge economic issues of the day. It allows students in those 30 minutes to become miniature experts on these fields that sometimes we never know what's going on. And so Garrett's going to perform extemporaneous speaking for us to show you just how great this event can be.
In selecting a host city for their 2024 national convention, many people thought the Democratic Party would go with a city such as Atlanta or Houston, major cities and states in which the party has made inroads in over the past few years. But last week, when the Democrats announced that they would host their convention in Chicago, many people were surprised. Chicago is a reliably blue city in a reliably blue state, prompting the question, did Democrats make a mistake in picking Chicago to host their 2024 national convention? However, we can see the answer to this question is no, because Chicago embodies their campaign strategy for 2024 in 3 main ways. First, because it is a prominent Midwestern city. Second, because it will show their commitment to labor and labor rights issues. And lastly, because it will provide the pomp and circumstance they want and need heading into 2024. First, we have to understand that it was not a mistake to choose Chicago because of its placement in the Midwest. As NPR reports on April 11th, that the Democrats' main goal in 2024 is to rebuild the so-called Blue Wall. This is the set of states ranging from Minnesota all the way over to Pennsylvania, states that have reliably voted blue in the past. But in the past recent elections, they have not necessarily been reliable states for the Democratic Party. If the Democrats want to regain these states as is necessary for a 2024 victory, they are going to have to show commitment to this area. And by hosting the convention in Chicago, it will show real commitment to the Midwest. CBS News on April 11th furthers by explaining that the Midwest has taken a bit of a swing to the right, with Ohio voting for Donald Trump both in 2016 and in 2020, and with Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan all voting for Donald Trump in 2016. These are states that Democrats have to win if they want to be victorious in 2024 because of the Electoral College system. So by hosting the convention in Chicago, ultimately the focus will be, for the party at least, on the Midwest. The sentiment was echoed by Illinois' Democratic Senator Tammy Duckworth when she said that the Midwest will be key to victory. By hosting the convention in Chicago, it will reframe the Democrats' mind on the issues affecting Midwestern Americans and Midwestern voters. Politico on April 11th furthers by explaining that by hosting the convention in Chicago, this will also allow the party to expand upon existing victories within the area. Point to the recent Supreme Court election in Wisconsin, or look to 2022, when Democrats regained control of the state of Michigan by both in the legislature and retaining the governorship. The Midwest is going to be key to victory, and by having the convention in Chicago, ultimately the Midwest could become more favorable. But secondly, we have to understand that it was not a mistake to host the convention in Chicago because of labor rights issues. Chicago and most of the Midwest is really heavily dependent on unions and have a large union population. Ultimately, these are voters that historically have voted for the Democrats, but in recent years have started drifting away. The Associated Press on April 11th furthers by explaining that Chicago is a very pro-union city and demonstrates that President Biden's pledge to be a pro-union president. Part of Joe Biden's 2024 campaign strategy is going to be capitalizing on those on his commitment for labor unions and workers' rights. Ultimately, by hosting the convention in Chicago, this will be speaking exactly to that audience that he wants to that he wants to keep and take away in 2024. The Hill on April 11th also furthers by explaining that Illinois' recently passed constitutional amendment to guarantee the right to unionize to workers gives Chicago the advantage over a state such as Georgia, where it is a right-to-work state. By having an extremely pro-union state being able to host their national convention, it will show that the Democrats are not are putting their money where their mouth is by hosting their convention in a state and city in which they know has been historically pro-union and will ultimately be able to speak exactly to those voters. Axios furthers this by explaining that this allows the White House to tout the recent victories when it comes to infrastructure, and will allow for a refocus on Midwestern and labor rights issues. If the Democratic Party wants to win in 2024, they are going to have to win back those union and blue collar voters that have gone away from them both in 2016 and in 2020. But thirdly, we have to understand that the decision to host the convention in Chicago was not a mistake because it provides the pomp and circumstance they need. Common logic may say that if you host the convention in a city that's inside a swing state, that it will ultimately give your party an advantage. But recent history disproves that. The New York Times on April 11th explains that looking backwards, this idea of hosting the convention in a swing state has often been overblown. Point to 2012 where Democrats hosted their convention in Charlotte, North Carolina, and lost North Carolina. The Republicans hosted their convention in Florida and then lost Florida. In 2016, the Democrats hosted their convention in Philadelphia and then went on to lose Pennsylvania. Location is often overblown and ultimately not a deciding factor in whether a state will vote for your party or not. But in addition to this, the convention doesn't sway voters. And add to this NBC News reporting on April 10th that President Biden told Al Roker that he plans on running for re-election. Ultimately, the National Convention is just a big old party for the party that's throwing it. It's about rallying the base and unifying a party. So why not host it in Chicago? Reuters on April 11th explains that Chicago is a reliably blue city. It is diverse. It is the practical embodiment of what the Democratic Party presents itself to be. Ultimately, the Democrats should be fine going to a city that they know they're going to be welcome and be embraced by. So, returning back to the question of, did the Democratic Party make a mistake in picking Chicago to host their 2024 convention? Ultimately, we saw the answer to this question was no, for 3 reasons. First, because of its strategic placement in the Midwest. Second, because it shows a focus on labor rights and unions. And lastly, because it provides the pomp and circumstance they need. While many people were hoping that Atlanta or Houston would ultimately be the choice, the Democrats went to Chicago. Maybe in a few years, they'll be able to go back to those states. But at least for now, Chicago will do.
Last December, NPR told the story of Hawa Alibeta, an elderly woman who narrowly escaped violent conflict in the African nation of Cameroon. The cause for this conflict? Climate change. Because of a sustained, years-long drought, farmers competed with one another over dwindling resources like food and water. What started as name-calling quickly escalated to full-blown violence, wherein 150 people died and several thousands more were gravely injured. During the course of the next several days, nearly 30,000 people fled to the neighboring country of Chad. Now a climate refugee, Hawa Alibeta is virtually homeless. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR for short, they define climate refugees as a person displaced because of climate change or relevant conflicts. Hotspots like Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and South Asia have undergone the brunt of global warming, ranging from brutal tropical storms, years-long droughts, and other extreme weather events. However, for those like Alibeta who are fleeing the dangerous environmental circumstances in their own home countries, there are no international legal protections in place for their safety. Today, we'll discuss the conditions that affect the protections for climate refugees, analyze their effects, before finally proposing 2 key solutions. First, there are 2 conditions that affect the protections for climate refugees. The first is the absence of social infrastructure in their own home countries. The second is the lack of international legal protections specifically for climate refugees. But first, we'll analyze the absence of social infrastructure. In November of 2022, the New York Times reported that Madagascar, the world's 4th poorest nation, has been battered by cyclones and earthquakes for decades. Millions in Madagascar are suffering from malnutrition and disease. And yet, the government is unable to develop a plan that targets any of these issues, citing simply a lack of money to do so. As a result, the government cannot provide basic services for its citizens like housing, education, or even food assistance. Like the Madagascans, millions of climate refugees come from poor, conflict-ridden nations. Natural disasters wreak havoc on their homes and exacerbate pre-existing tensions like civil war and famine. However, their respective national governments are unable to provide the basic stability that their citizens need, resulting in millions emigrating. However, though climate refugees may be able to escape from their home countries, they are still far from safe. This is because there is a lack of international legal protections specifically for climate refugees. Amnesty International furthers that because of the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, it defines a refugee as a person seeking asylum from persecution based on racial, religious, or other grounds. This definition, written well over 70 years ago, notably excludes climate refugees and thus bars them from protections such as prevention from deportation. This factor has ultimately culminated in the landmark court case of Ion Titiota versus New Zealand in April of 2021. Titiota fought a years-long legal battle to remain in New Zealand after escaping his home country of Kiribati. Kiribati is one of the lowest lying nations in the world, and is yet being quickly swallowed up by rising sea levels as a result of climate change. However, the courts ruled that because neither New Zealand nor international law dealt specifically with climate refugees, New Zealand immigration agencies could deport Titiota back to the sinking island of Kiribati. The weak international protections and the absence of social infrastructure have 2 disastrous effects. The first is the cycle of poverty in underdeveloped nations. The second is the worsening of an already extreme refugee crisis. But first, will analyze the cycle of poverty. Underdeveloped nations are often agricultural in nature, with the majority of the citizens being subsistence farmers. Somaliland, an African country, is no exception, as agriculture is their second most important economic sector. However, Somaliland has been battling a years-long drought, thus resulting in one man, Ibrahim, to travel 400 miles on foot in search of food and water for his cattle. Unfortunately, he was unsuccessful, and over half of his animals died. This financially ruined Ibrahim and the several thousands others like him. The poor climate forces people to leave their homes in search of economic security for themselves and for their families. Unfortunately, this results in a mass exodus of able-bodied laborers, leaving no one to contribute to the economy back home. As a result, the economy is severely weakened, and the government does not have the money to create safety net programs or other sustainable development. Thus, the government is vastly underprepared for the next environmental disaster, resulting in even millions more leaving. Thus, This leads us to our second effect, the worsening of an already extreme refugee crisis. For most host countries, the refugee admissions programs are slow, bureaucratic, and likely to change at any given moment. Most host countries have totally decimated their own admissions programs. For example, the Council on Foreign Relations reports that the United States, once the world leader in refugee admissions, had an admissions ceiling of 200,000 people per year in the 1980s. And yet, as of 2021, that refugee admission ceiling was lowered to 15,000 people per year. For refugees waiting on admission, they reside in refugee camps. The largest camp in the world is located in Dadaab, Kenya, home to over 300,000 people. That's larger than the city of St. Louis, Missouri. Overcrowding, mixed with skyrocketing food prices, has resulted in widespread malnourishment in these camps. And further, because people's immune systems are weakened from starvation, it's allowed communicable diseases like tuberculosis and cholera to tear through these camps like wildfire. And yet, with the worsening of climate change, there will be more climate refugees seeking asylum in 2023 and beyond. However, there are two solutions that we can implement to solve for the crisis of climate refugees. The first is to support current UN efforts for those on the front lines of climate change. The second is to expand the definition of refugee in US domestic law. But first, we'll talk about how we can support current UN efforts. If at the end of the event, to the left, there is a pile of QR codes, one of which is for the United Nations donation page that they've set up specifically for climate refugees. With your valuable economic contributions, your funds will go towards two projects: sustainable development in underdeveloped nations and safety net programs. With sustainable development, countries like Madagascar, Somaliland, and Cameroon can develop climate-resilient cities. These cities are immune to the effects of climate change and thus won't be burnt up in drought or washed away by flood, but can remain standing after extreme weather events and provide their citizens the stability that they need. Further, with safety net programs, underdeveloped nations can finally begin providing stability to their citizens with education, housing, food assistance, which everyone needs. This can help to slow the outpour of immigrants going from one country to another and halt the cycle of poverty. Second, we can expand the definition of refugee in US domestic law. There is a second QR code labeled change.org, which will take you directly to a petition that demands that Congress expand the definition of refugee. By expanding the definition, we are classifying climate refugees as legitimate asylum seekers, thus giving them access to protections like prevention from deportation. Secondly, it'll also help put the US back as the leader of refugee admissions. If the US expands its definition, it's encouraging other countries to expand its own protections, thus benefiting immigrants and climate refugees worldwide. So today, we've discussed the conditions that affect climate refugees, analyzed their effects, before finally proposing two solutions to help climate refugees. Returning to the story of Hawa Ali Betta, She still resides in Chad as of today. In regards to the situation, she says you obviously have to accept whatever you are given. Hopefully, with your support, we can give Hawa Aliveta, Ion Titiota, Ibrahim, and the millions others like them the ending to their story that they need.
The last event we're going to demonstrate for you today is communication analysis. This event looks very much like the kind of academic work a critical cultural scholar or a rhetorical scholar would do. It's a deep dive into some kind of communication, assessing that communication using an academic theory or a model to better understand what its purpose is and how impactful it is. Garrett, in his senior year appropriately, was able to take his love for sports communication and specifically his BA degree in sports communication and integrate that with forensics. He found a message happening within the world of sport that was compelling, it was unique, and it was a model for others to follow. And that's exactly the criteria for a good topic for a communication analysis. I don't want to tell you too much more and blow the surprise. I'm going to let Garrett explain it to you.
Former Senator from Georgia, Kelly Loeffler, does not support the Black Lives Matter movement. So much so that when the WNBA embraced the movement, she wrote a letter to the league calling their move divisive. Despite the fact that Kelly Loeffler owned a WNBA team when she said that. Her team, the Atlanta Dream, were perhaps the most critical of Loeffler's statements, staging what was basically a public rebuke of their owner. This very public clash between a team and their owner showcased the difficulties of advocating for a cause that is rejected by the people in power. So, to further analyze the Dream's actions, we'll turn to the framework discussed in the article, Identification by Transitive Property, Intermediated Consubstantiality in the NFL's Salute to Service campaign, published by Eli Mangold and Charles Goring in the August 2018 edition of Critical Studies in Media Communication. Using their example of the National Football League, we'll look to answer the research question: how can athlete activists serve as liaisons between social movements and their intended audiences? Mangold and Goring's framework is ideal, not only because it is rooted in a sports context, but because it explains how individual players were able to come together to communicate a league-wide message, creating a strong parallel to the Dream. So first, we'll look to better understand Mangold and Goring's framework, apply that same relationship to the Dream, before finally drawing some critical implications. The idea that intermediated consubstantiality can be achieved through identification by transitive property is first proposed in Mangold and Goring's analysis of the NFL's Salute to Service campaign. In this case, intermediated consubstantiality could just be described as a shared feeling of oneness between two groups through the involvement of a buffer group. Mangold and Goring outlined three key tenets to achieve intermediated consubstantiality through their proposal of identification by transitive property. In their first tenet, Mangold and Goring open up the possibility for buffer groups. Essentially, if Group A wants Group C to identify with them, Group B can come in and serve as an intermediary group. Group B serves as a commonality between the two. In the NFL's case, Group A, the citizen fans, cannot necessarily easily identify with Group C, the soldiers. But by bringing in Group B, the NFL players in the Salute to Service campaign, citizen fans were able to see the admiration that NFL players showed towards members of the United States military. And since fans already identify with players, they're able to identify with soldiers as a result. In their second tenet, Mangold and Goring expressed the need for visual modes of identification. The ways in which images are framed, shot, and stylized can all impact identification, even blocking it entirely. In the NFL's case, there were several banner images that appeared on the NFL Salute to Service campaign website. These images depicted NFL players as if they themselves were the soldiers. In their third tenet, Mangold and Goring expressed the need for shared speech and messaging between Groups A and B. This is seen because the players in the Salute to Service campaign were able to serve as empty signifiers, upon which the NFL was able to inscribe the shared speech and messaging between players and soldiers. Those ideas of honor, courage, strength, and sacrifice. Because these ideals are already associated with soldiers, as well as players, the two become consubstantial with one another. However, players would often say that their courage and sacrifice does not match that of soldiers, a common saying among citizen fans as well. The resulting relationship between the three groups is identification by transitive property. Having better understood Mangold and Goring's framework, we can now begin to apply the same relationship to the dream. Turning towards the first tenet, we can see how the Atlanta Dream themselves serve as an intermediary group. In this case, Group A is the WNBA, and they are trying to promote the Black Lives Matter message. Group B are the Atlanta Dream players, and Group C are the Dream fans, who are also Georgia voters. Now, unlike the NFL's case, the WNBA did not employ the Dream to promote Black Lives Matter. However, without the Dream's involvement, the Dream fans and Georgia voters would not have a team to attach that messaging to. The Dream had to serve as an intermediary group. In the second tenet, Mangold and Goring expressed the need for visual modes identification. USA Today on August 5th, 2020 explains that in the days after Loeffler made her statements condemning the WNBA embracing Black Lives Matter, that prompted her team to wear the shirts donning the phrase, "Vote Warnock," referring to Loeffler's main opponent in that Senate race, Reverend Raphael Warnock. This was a clear visual rebuke of their owner, not just because of the t-shirts themselves, but because they were worn during the warm-ups of a Dream game. People were able to see the Dream and attach that messaging to both the Dream and the WNBA. Interestingly, later on in their article, Mangold and Goring go on to explain the particular effectiveness photos serve as visual modes. This further strengthens the connection to the Dream because many people saw these shirts through the photos that circulated before, during, and after the game. In their third tenet, Mangold and Goring expressed the need for shared speech and messaging between Groups A and B. This is seen because both the WNBA and the Atlanta Dream position themselves to communicate Black Lives Matter. What makes this messaging even more impactful is the fact the Dream were owned by Loeffler. Thus, their actions were able to mitigate any messaging she sent through her condemnation, through their promotion, still allowing that same message to carry on to the Georgia voters. The resulting relationship between the WNBA, the Atlanta Dream, and the Dream fans and Georgia voters is identification by transitive property. Returning to our research question, how can athlete activists serve as liaisons between social movements and their intended audiences? We saw that individual players were able to come together to communicate a league-wide message. The Atlanta Dream players example leaves us with two critical implications. First, sports are an effective avenue for political advocacy. And two, the rhetorical power of clothing. But first, sports are becoming more and more politicized. The Guardian, on January 6, 2021, explains that the days of the Republicans buy sneakers too mindset is over. Politics in sports is here to stay. The WNBA specifically has been at the forefront of this movement through their support of causes such as Black Lives Matter, support for the LGBTQ+ community, support for Planned Parenthood, and their work to help survivors of domestic assault. So not only are sports and politics becoming more and more intertwined, but it's actually working. The aforementioned Guardian article explains that in the days after the Dream wore their shirts, Warnock skyrocketed in the polls, achieving $240,000 in new donations from almost 4,000 new individual donors. And Warnock won that Senate race. A second critical implication is that clothing can carry real rhetorical significance. Following the Dream using shirts to rebuke Loeffler, it is clear that the clothes we wear can take on rhetorical meaning. In January of this year, Philadelphia Flyers defenseman Ivan Provorov refused to wear the team's Pride-themed jerseys during warm-ups. Newsweek on January 18, 2023 explains that this decision created a league-wide message that Provorov was indeed not an ally. Despite him never saying those words, by not wearing the jersey, his message was sent. So today, we have better understood Mangold and Goring's framework, successfully applied that same relationship to the dream, and found some critical implications. Kelly Loeffler has since sold her stake in the Atlanta Dream, but it only came after her team's actions. Sports have shown a long potential for political advocacy, and the Dream players' efforts show just how far that potential can go.